Hi, thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about this project that I worked on. And before I start with that, it makes sense to tell you a little bit about my own weird journey with being an internet journalist. I started out my career at the Post, and no one knew what my job was, and no one knew who my boss was. And I was just the kid who did the internet. And people would come up to me. So I worked for the National and Politics desk. And people would come up to me, editors would come to me and say, "We want to do like something cool on the internet. Can you do that?" It's like, okay, sure. Which meant I could do basically whatever I wanted. And I did all sorts of weird stuff, like took them on Snapchat when I had this like important meeting with senior editors and was like, "Hello, you know that app that everyone texts on? We're going to get on that." They were like, "What is wrong with you?" It was 2014. No one really understood that. But I was very curious about using the internet to tell stories and less so about like distribution and audience, which all comes with telling stories. Then I went to CNN, also made up a job where no one really knew what I did. No one knew what my title was. I worked on emerging platforms and unexpected platforms. So everything from launching them in Facebook Messenger and Kik and Line to why don't we send out disposable cameras to people in Iraq? Because that would be cool. Again, like seek forgiveness, don't ask permission. And then I quit my job. I was in New York at the time. I left to freelance around Asia. And that is when this kind of started coming to life, where I was writing about gender. And I was writing the types of stories that editors commission at large news organizations, where you write about the horrible things that are happening to women around the world and the horrible things that are happening to girls around the world. And like look at how messed up power structures are, which they are. And then you find the story of that one exceptional girl who's fighting back. And then it's like an uplifting story and a story of solutions. And it's fine, I was doing it. But I was more curious about what it meant to just be a girl in the world because I didn't feel like I was seeing any of these stories out there. I didn't know what it meant to just be a normal person. You know, what is it like for, you hear all these statistics about like child marriage in India or female genital mutilation. And it's like, what is it like for an average girl who deals with all this stuff, but also like, what does she worry about? And, you know, what does she talk to her friends about? So I went to the Lilly, who do interesting stuff with platforms, and I said, hey, I want to do something kind of weird, where I want to tell girl stories using their own voices and their own words. And how would you feel about me just collecting diary entries from teenage girls around the world? Because for any of you who have been a teenage girl, it's a pretty common experience everywhere in the world that you work through your feelings, your identity, like how you exist in the world and who you want to be and what you want to do in your journal or your diary. It's a safe space. And what if we could take that safe space and share it with the world, with the girls' permission and their parents' permission and all that? And, you know, what would that look like? And this is what it looked like. This is Jennifer in Nigeria. And a lot of what you hear and read in the last few years from Nigeria has been about Boko Haram and the Chibok girls who were out of school. But what was it like for girls in other parts of Nigeria? I really like Jennifer's diary entries because she's really feisty and she like gets really upset with a friend of hers who like wants to set her up with this boy and she's just not into it and like hangs up the phone. She's like, "I'm not doing this." And it was very relatable. I live a very different life from Jennifer, but I could relate to that. She doesn't go to school. She has to take care of her younger siblings, which is like her circumstances, but also you have this other side. This is from a girl who lived in Zatari, a refugee camp in Jordan, and she wrote about her life and her days and the war. And a lot of the refugee stories I had been covering at CNN and I had seen other people cover were, again, like stories of horror, but I wanted to know just like what she thought about every day. And the war played into that. Other things played into it too. Like she talked about her friends. And she drew some pictures for us, which was kind of cool. And you got to see how she was viewing the world. So what do you do once you have all these diary entries, right? Like I have all this information and how do we put it out into the world and what makes sense? Like what is the best way to tell the story? Because there's something so incredibly intimate about a diary entry. Like you are sitting there with someone as they're processing their day and they're letting you into their like internal world. We decided that it made sense for this to also go into an intimate space, which are newsletters. The Lilly has a newsletter called Lilly Lines, and I took it over for about 2.5 months, and it was like on a separate thing where it was a pop-up newsletter. It went out once a week, and in your inbox, you got diary entries from girls in different parts of the world. We paired a little bit of information about the countries they were living in, the themes they were talking about, the things they were writing about, with also just their own words, their own photos. You sometimes heard from two girls, like in this case, who lived in the same city or the same country. You got to see two sides of a place because I was very conscious of the fact that you don't want anyone to have to speak for an identity or a country or any of that, and wanted to make it clear that this was not the case. This was just one girl's life, and maybe you can get something out of that, and like maybe you'll see a little piece of the world. And we paired that with information about the things they wrote about. So it wasn't just like, hey, this is a girl, she's dealt with this. It exists like on its own. And we thought about where else we could take that. Like, what other spaces did this make sense in? Instagram was an easy and obvious one, where the things we curate on, the things we see on Instagram are so curated and like so thought out, right? It's like there is like the perfect Instagram photo. And this was kind of the opposite, because it was literally from family photo albums very often. We tried to get as many photos from the girls' perspectives as possible. It was also kind of breaking through the bubble, because most news organizations, I find at least as a consumer and as someone who had to create content for Instagram, have a voice and a certain type of story they're constantly telling. And this was a little different, where it was like breaking through that noise, and you were just getting to hear from someone you wouldn't otherwise be following, because why would you be following a 16-year-old girl you didn't know? That would be weird if you were. Don't do that. And like, again, this is Halima. She lives in Mazar-e-Sharif. She doesn't have a phone. She's not going to be posting photos of herself on Instagram, but isn't this a great photo? Like, you get to see a little bit about her life. You get to see her family. You get to see her school. She shared all of that with us. And in other circumstances, Halima's story would be told as a story about women's empowerment in Afghanistan, worries about the Taliban and with the peace talks right now, about like the situation for women, which was all there, but it was also like hey, this is what my brother did today, and it was annoying. And there was something in that which I really loved, where they became less of like, this is what it's like for girls, and more just real people. This project has now turned into a book, so it'll be out next year. 30 girls around the world sharing pieces of their lives. And what I've found in doing this and building it into more is that there are themes that are pretty universal in terms of how we all exist in the world, and the things we worry about, the things we hope for, the things we want to talk about, the things that we're afraid of talking about. And it's kind of great to see that those themes kind of apply universally, whether you live in Mazar-e-Sharif or you live in the Midwest. So I'm going to show you some other projects which have similar ideas to give you a sense of other ways you can bring unexpected platforms together. It was around, I think it was 2016 when I did this. I recently read about a thing called Mean World Syndrome, which psychologists in the 70s came up with, which is like with the advent of cable news. And they were trying to figure out how it affected people like the way we study social media now. And what they realized was that seeing all the horrible headlines constantly on loop made people think that the world was really bad, because that's the news we get from the world. And I was in the midst of like covering politics in America and feeling like the world was really bad. And I wanted to know what it was like to be a person in the world, in the parts of the world we were covering, because we were talking a lot about immigration and refugees, but we weren't really like seeing outside of our bubble. And I had done a lot of these projects in the past where you jump into Instagram or you jump into Twitter or you jump into Facebook and you mine using hashtags or location, and you find images and you ask people for permission and you put out Google forms and you crowdsource. But there's a limitation to that of the people who exist on those platforms, the people who are willing to share on those platforms. The type of photos and stories we choose to share on those platforms based on like what the entire ecosystem looks like at that point, and also our audiences on there. So this was one of those. I called up the international desk editor and was like, hey, I got a weird idea. Can you just say yes? She was like, okay, what do you want to do? And I said I was going to send disposable cameras out to, this was like, I was at a large organization, I had the reach, where I was going to send disposable cameras out to producers in 20 different countries. And their instructions were very simple. Like, I needed some sort of thematic something, right? And telling a story, you can't just have random people. So I was going to ask for mothers, like, what is it like to be a mother in the world? And that was all Those were the only instructions. Like, find a mother who you think is interesting. You know your country better than I do. You know the people around you in your community better than I do. So I'm not going to give you some crazy instructions. I will give you instructions in the types of photos I'm looking for, which is very much like daily life. I want to see their kitchen. I want to, those photos that everyone takes from up above of like their meal and post them on Instagram. I wanted to see their breakfasts or their dinners. Like, I wanted to see what food looked like. I wanted to see what bedtime looked like, what their walk to work looked like. And what was interesting and compelling and surprising to me was how many of these I related to and my colleagues related to and my friends related to, where there was one from Turkey where there's a photo of this little girl and her dad with a big bowl of popcorn watching TV. I've never been to Turkey, but I saw myself in that photo, and I was obsessed with that photo, and everyone was like, why are you so obsessed with this? But that to me was very relatable. There were always kids with backpacks going to school. Pretty much every country you got kids with backpacks going to school, because that's what life looks like everywhere, and it kind of looks the same. Just like very relatable. There was a woman in London who sent a photo. It was a mirror selfie with a disposable camera, so kind of like a weird high-low of mediums, with a glass of wine and her kid in the bathtub. And that was like so relatable to so many people I knew. But like, they didn't know that woman, but we saw something of ourselves in it. And this is the last thing I'm going to tell you guys about. It was February of 2016, and I had just moved to New York, and I kind of hated it. And I wanted to do something interesting and hear about real life for people. And so my bosses, again, were like, please just don't quit your job. Go out and do whatever you want. Don't spend too much money. I had a budget of like $10 because I didn't want to spend more of my own money. That went on nice paper. I printed out this, set up a Google Voice account with a phone number, and started putting it up. On the coldest day of the year, because I'm not very smart, I walked around all of Manhattan, parts of Queens and Brooklyn, and just went to every laundromat I could, went to every public space I could where I could put up a billboard, because the legal department had given me lots of serious warnings about what would happen to me if I put these up in places I was not allowed to put these up in, because I asked the legal department for advice. There was no CNN branding on this. It was just an ask, tell us your love story. And we started, I didn't know what I was going to do with them when I got them. I didn't know that anyone would actually call in a number, because who does that? That's kind of weird. But we started getting really great stories, put them on SoundCloud. This is all free because I had no budget for this. Made a Twitter account. You should, if you're ever in a mood where you want some good feels, go to this Twitter account, Hello Love Story. It still exists, or cnn.com/lovestory. And there's all these love stories out there. And we just started putting them on social, and they started picking up because it was kind of like a dark time on the internet, and everyone just wanted some joy and cheer. And this was some joy and cheer, and it was kind of nice. But the question I got at the end of it was Masuma, how does this relate to the news? You are a journalist, you work at a very serious news organization, you're supposed to be covering breaking news. Love stories are nice, but the nice thing with something like this, and the nice thing with playing with platforms and playing with spaces like voicemails, which are incredibly intimate, right? The idea that you get to call in and you know someone will be listening on the other side, but it's just you with your thoughts. And then on the other side, we get to hear their voices, which are also incredibly intimate, is that you can then use this, it worked, in other places. So in the aftermath of the 2016 election, everyone was feeling a lot of feels. We were feeling feels in private, and we could see that people were feeling feels on the internet. We didn't know how to tell that story. And I was like, hey, how would you feel if I just spun up a voicemail inbox and let's see what happens? Did that. Put one post on Facebook, one post on Twitter. We had a big following, but that was it. Got more than 8,000 voicemails. And that was what we reported from for all kinds of projects in the months that followed, because we had people telling us about their lives, telling us about their feelings, telling us about how they voted and why they voted the way they did. And it was a nice way to also just hear from regular people, because you had all the data and all the polling gone bad and all of that. But this is what it was like to be a person in that moment. And it was nice to be able to pair this unexpected medium and the intimacy of it with all the noise on social and just cut through that for 1 second. That's all I've got.
Yeah, sorry. Wondering how this did in terms of audience compared to more traditional kinds of journalism.
I don't know which project you're asking about.
Oh, sorry, but each of them, I guess.
They all did shockingly well, is really all I can say, because they all started out with, there are projects that have failed that I'm not showing you, but Most of my projects start out with like a weird idea, a thought that it would be good to hear from like a regular person. And then only when we realize that there's something there and there's a seed of something there, do we build on that and make it into something bigger. So if we put out the first piece of something and no one engages with it, no one's into it, that's the end of the project. Or it's, okay, why did this go wrong? What can we learn from that? But most of them did very, very well. Like for the Lilly, I know that the open rate was very high. We got more responses than they said that they had gotten in most other things. I was getting I was a freelancer. I had no, at that point, association with the post except for this project. I was getting a lot more emails than I would have expected from people asking me how to reach the girls, how to help with the project, suggesting more countries. So yeah.
Coming. Hi, how are you? Hello? Hi. I used to be an assignment editor, and so my question to you is, in any of these projects you pitched, did you get a no? And if you got a no, how did you fight for it?
That's a good question. I got this is a weird idea, and then I took it to someone else, which is maybe not the right answer, but I felt like all the projects always had legs, and I knew that, and I was conscious of that. I tried to figure out why they said no. So sometimes it was, we don't have the staff to build something out. And I was like for the disposable cameras, I worked around the system for every single piece of that. When we decided to put it on, we made social videos and all of that, made a standalone website, and I had to convince designers and developers to donate their time to the project, because I went to them and was like, here are some photos, look at them, aren't they beautiful? And they were like, yeah, they are beautiful. Okay, I'll give you 3 hours. Come back with a very clear idea of what you want. But yeah.
It's amazing, intimate work. What's the process for helping people understand, the people participating, understand the consequences of it? And when it's voicemail, which is this very short touch thing, how did you get their permission to use it and to help them understand what they were being part of?
So for the voicemails, when you called in the number, which I'm sure still has some sort of prompt for something CNN has done since then, if you want to call in and find out, I had a legally approved, this is what it is, and then there was me saying, this is what the project is. Especially for the political ones, we did it after the travel ban. We did it a year after Pulse to talk to the queer community. We did it after the election. If I was going to use someone's voice, I was going to call them back and report it out. That was the beginning, not the end point. For everything else, I make it very clear. I give all the information about what it'll look like, how it'll live, where it'll live. And then with the book for the Girlhood Diaries, I'm very conscious of the fact that these girls are going to grow up. And they might not want their words out there when they're 35. They're 13 right now. So I'm having conversations with them, their families, trying to figure out whether we want to use first names. Is there a situation where I'm going to endanger someone by using their name? Do we want to change names? It's all the conversations you would be having as a reporter or an editor about any of these projects or any reporting. It's just in a different way, in a different space.
Just behind you. In the nicest way.
Thanks. For the Lilly projects, you talked about sharing the stories of girls with whom you got their permission and the permission of their parents. What about the girls who can't get the permission of their parents? What ideas do you have for sharing their stories?
I think that's a really good question. Unfortunately, with the way laws work and the fact that I work with large news organizations, I wouldn't be able to do that. And that's just the fact of the matter. There are other ways in which I think about are there spaces where girls are having certain conversations where 3 of the girls wouldn't feel comfortable talking about it, but 1 of them would? Or someone has gone through the process, is 18 right now, and could talk back about being 15 or 16. And going through what some girls are going through at 15 and 16, their parents wouldn't give them permission, or they wouldn't feel comfortable asking for permission. I had a conversation recently with someone who was trying to connect me with a girl who wasn't out to her family. And we talked about what that would mean and whether it made sense for her to participate in something where she would be sharing her story widely. And the answer was no at this time, and that was okay.
Front row.
Thanks, Masuma. I have a question about how, because not everyone in the audience, I suppose, would be able or kind of be going to do these kinds of projects that are so sort of innovative. I wanted to ask your kind of advice about how we might incorporate some of the methodologies that you've been talking about into our everyday sort of reporting, and putting the individual stories of people that might not have a voice in traditional news reporting or even kind of feature writing at the fore.
I think there are two parts to that I can think of. One is we often exist within or ask for stories within bubbles, especially when you're like looking for the average voice or the man in the street, or you're going to like the diner in America, at least, to like talk to the average American voter, and you stop there, right? Like you get your 3 voices and then you're done. You're like done with that part of the checkbox and like the checklist of like, this is what I'm looking for. And it helps sometimes to not go in with an agenda. And generally, like most reporters, you don't go in with an agenda, you go in with questions to find out more. But as much as possible, if you can go in with more curiosity and just like let people show you their lives and talk to people who exist outside your bubbles, and that might require more legwork and that might be hard, but it's often worth it, I find. And then in terms of the storytelling side of it, every project cannot and does not have to be something like the stuff I do, but I think there's always space to do side projects like this, or incorporate some of the, this isn't every story, into anything you're doing.
Can I selfishly ask a question as well? Because that kind of builds
You
on that
can,
one.
but it's the very last one, because
Oh,
I was meant to
gosh,
shut it
okay, well,
down
you'll have
then.
to
You've
get
got
her over
powers,
drinks.
it's fine.
It builds on the last one. When we were chatting before, you were telling me a story about reaching somebody in Mongolia and how you were connecting with them. And it builds on that question, like, how did you find that person, or how do you find somebody that is kind of to you and me inaccessible?
Right, so the story that Sarah is referring to, one of the girls in the book lives in Mongolia, and her family are nomadic eagle hunters, and so they move every 4 months or 3 months. And I've been struggling to get her legal release form from her father because they don't have electricity or cell service right now where they are. And it's hard. And we're working on like getting a messenger on a horse to them, perhaps, to get the legal. This is like outrageous. But I just like cast a very wide net. I don't really know what I'm looking for when I start talking to people. I emailed every person whose email address I could guess or find who worked for any sort of NGO or was a teacher or worked with children or was invested in women in Mongolia. Like I did all the Googles I could and like probably sent like a good 50 emails, 60 emails. And it was really funny because the same woman replied to me from 3 different email addresses, and she's the one who ended up helping me out, and she just like had like a finger in lots of different pots. But I try and talk to as many people as possible. Everywhere I go, I'm just like, hey, do you know someone at this place? Like, people I met once will get messages from me being like, I remember you said that you spent a year in the Pacific Islands. Are you still friends with anyone there? Do you still have contacts there? So I basically just talk to anyone I can.